Okay, Andy, so we've come to the end of year one of SOBM, and that really has a curriculum that we see everybody to follow and taking us through the journey from we've got practice, got all these problems. I couldn't possibly take time off work because we'll run into losses and the practice can't sustain itself, into what we are seeing now is bringing the kind of final pieces for a lot of the SOBM members to take it to a what I would refer to as a self-managing company. That means that they have the systems in place for how the company operates, that they can take an extended holiday, but also that, and something that there's nobody quite like you that can do it, can take the practice through a financial development system, where they are working in their practice through choice, that the practice can sustain itself, if the principal owner wasn't to work there. Can you just explain in a bit more detail on how SOBM delivers that?
Yeah. I mean, if we go back to how SOBM came into being, that was born out of a conversation that you and I were having, just like this one morning, where you'd probably be telling me things that are happening in your group, and I'm just saying, oh, I had a client that had this problem, a client had that. And then you said to me, well, why don't we put something together that overcomes all those issues? And I call it the treacle, the stuff that bogs you down. And SOBP follow the same process with every single client. We never deviate. Okay, there's a 4-stage system, and yet there are a small percentage of people, maybe 5, who don't get the same results as the other 95%. And you've got to ask yourself, if we're using the same system, what's common to that 5%? And it's all the issues that we've dealt with in SOBM. So, there's very little that you can do in a business that doesn't affect the numbers. So although we're very numerical and we start with numbers and we end with numbers, the bit in between, the non-numerical bit, is the bit that we have to fix, because we know that when those things that are not numerical are broken, they have an impact on the numbers. Such things as, I've got an associate who discounts, I've got an associate who runs late, we've got too much gaps in the diary, the marketing's not working, the recall process is broken, the practice manager's not very good at making decisions. All those things will have a financial impact in the numbers. And so SOBM really has been about, how do we take each of those areas, whether it's communication, change management, leadership, how you run a meeting, the basics of the fundamental basics of running a business. And now what we want to do on day 4 is to say, well, let's go back to the numbers and let's look at how we can take the business to higher and higher levels of financial performance. But in doing so, let's look at the things that previously would have got in the way, some of these behavioral issues. And now let's try and see how we would overcome those things by referring back to what we've been learning on the first 3 days. And then hopefully that thing will no longer be an issue that stops us taking the business to the desired levels of performance.
Great. And do you think that, so we put an operational system in how to manage and collaborate with teams, including from one surgery practices up to something that's numerous surgeries, multiple sites, and a replicatable system within there. And in that journey, we're now developing things, so you're creating strategic goals and actions into that growth that you have to achieve. Where do you think that the possible, for those who don't know what they don't know, in terms of the managing a practice side, what do you see as the kind of key aspects of those improvements, from creating a better operation to managing the financials better to all of a sudden having a really, really strong business, that the practice owner is feeling well rewarded for? Where do you see the kind of key aspects that we've typically seen over the last year?
Yeah, you know, a lot of businesses sometimes are people driven, and they're people driven in some cases to get very good results, but it's still, to me, a risk to do that, because when the business is driven by a person rather than a process, when once that person walks out the door, or you want to take the sabbatical, then the business doesn't function the same way. And what was quite interesting, I think, on day one, when we got everyone together, was we asked them what they wanted. And I keep thinking about this. I've thought about it lots and lots. They pretty much all came back to the same thing, which wasn't what I expected. And the two things that everybody said they wanted was to be able to scale the business. So in other words, we're going to scale it to higher levels of performance, and to have a business in what is self-managed. And then, we started to look at how do you do that? So whether you want to scale by organically growing the business that you own, so you've got no intention of making acquisitions, but you do want to take the business you've got to the highest possible level of performance, whether you want to start a squat and grow that way, or in the case of you, not only growing the businesses that you've acquired, but continually making the acquisitions. So you're actually firing on many cylinders. So, to be able to do that, people find it difficult to extract the owner without financial loss. So you have to plan that. That's the strategic plan. So obviously when you replace somebody who's a big hitter, most principals are big hitters, they're a large part of the profit. When you replace them with a clinician who now has to be paid, and you are introducing that new cost into your profit and loss account, then clearly, if you don't do anything alongside that, the profits are going to go backwards, because you're adding a cost and nothing else. So we have to plan financially how we can get the business to a level that enables the owner to come out without loss of profit, hopefully even growth in profit. But the two things that people were looking to get from this was not only to get themselves out clinically, but to be able to take time away from the business from an administration point of view, so the business ticks over just the same as when they're in it. And of course, again, that needs to be financially planned. And you also need to get, personally, when we talk about a self-managed business, I think a business that manages itself is probably going to go backwards. I don't think a business that's not managed would improve its result, okay? But self-managed, in my book, means that it still needs to be managed, but not necessarily to the same extent by the person who owns it today. And therefore, you need somebody to be able to take the reins and to be able to largely run that business in your absence in exactly the same way as if you were there. And so what people are now getting from SOBM is not just the leadership skills and the planning and the financial control and the scalability. People are also getting the fact that they're now bringing the managers along, and the managers are starting to grow as individuals. And you need both those things to be able to achieve what we set SOBM up for in the first place. And I think the fact that so many people have shown a desire to want to carry on to year two clearly is evidence that people have got massive value from year one.